No.
Hey, Michael, how's it going?
Good, good. Almost ready for Texas.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it would be tough. I'm only for 3 days there, so it will be quite
Intense
tough.
then.
Yes, but on the other side, maybe without a jet lag when I come back.
Well, here's hoping.
Yeah. Let's see, what do we have for today? But they are cool. Did you see the topics? I'm looking forward to what Matt will be talking about.
Honestly, I'm looking forward to most of them.
Yeah.
They're all good stuff.
Yeah, but there are like some conceptual stuff, so like some ideas that are really intriguing. I still have to finish my talk. Let's see. Add experimental, that could be interesting. Proposal. Yeah, but so what we also have to really look at is that we get the HTTP working group again up and running. I talked with Andy on that a bit.
Yeah.
And we need some place where we specify at least a minimum where we can point to. Because at the moment we have a couple of servers implementing this, even if it's a draft, because the draft, I mean, we are also like implementing when something hits is a draft, we start implementing it.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be good, like I'm always thinking that maybe we should encode what was the good best practices so far as a version 1, and then iterate from there instead of trying to get this.
Yeah, well, that was the original proposal for this, right? Was that it was just going to be here's the status quo, here is how people generally do things. But then the question came up, which it may have been my fault, for the content type. And what we figured then was actually the content type is, without the content type, then you can't really do the status codes. Like you can't reliably interpret it, right? So we basically, we wanted to make it as if it was required. And I think Lee's opinion on it was, it doesn't have to be just a reflection of the status quo. It can also say what the situation should be. But I also I think it's pretty critical that we don't, go overboard and start specifying how WebSockets work and how it works over SSE and things like that. Like, we need an initial 1.0 that is basically the status quo. I had to step back from it for a while because I was just too busy with other things, but I am actually keen to start getting going again on that. So it's possible, maybe we can start setting up some working groups again, some meetups.
And I think this one, we need a bare minimum, which is easy to achieve for all the implementations.
Mm-hmm.
So that we don't, so it would be bad, in my opinion, if we break everyone from day one. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like if we can get a specification for the HTTP stuff that meets what most of the people do, or where it doesn't take a lot to get there.
Yeah, and I think that can be managed with careful use of the word should rather than must. Yeah. Like, they should use the GraphQL content type, but the
problem is a bit the client, so because because then they must implement it like it's today. So they must understand the application JSON.
Well, the clients are the ones that perform content negotiation, right? So the client should be indicating, I want the GraphQL HTTP type, the GraphQL MIME type, but failing that, I want JSON. And the server should look at that automatically. And if it only supports JSON, then it will just respond with JSON. It should just work. It shouldn't be breaking, I think, unless I'm missing something.
But the current clients don't ask for the content plug. They could just say, because the accept header doesn't have to be set. A lot of clients don't do that.
Yeah, that is true. But also, if you don't set an accept header, it's unlikely that you are interpreting the content type header on the response. So in that case, if you're ignoring headers on the way out, you're probably ignoring them on the way in which case it's not a breaking change either.
Yeah, but the status codes are then set. So like the specification is today, it will then use the status code behavior.
Well, we can say if there is no accept type, then for legacy support, we use JSON.
Yeah, that's exactly what would be good.
Yeah,
like
I'm well on board for that.
Because that is the main thing. Like if we have like legacy clients, they just work. And yeah,
I think we should, as best we can, support basically all the legacy setup that everyone has, while still seriously encouraging the use of this content type, because without it, as I say, the status codes aren't useful. So if we can start encouraging people to use them, but do it in a way where if you don't use the accept header, then we just fall back on the legacy behavior, but you should send an accept header.
Yeah,
I think that's sufficient.
Yeah, because the issue that Andy had was that I don't remember which, but I think the JetBrains plugin for I don't know if it was not Rider, but for their Java suite, they started implementing the client specification, and then it didn't work with the GraphQL Java server anymore.
Mm-hmm. We should hop off of this now because time has ticked over.
Oh, it's great. I love joining the call, and we're right in the middle of the technical discussions. That's awesome.
No, I just.
Shmuel, come.
Yeah, it's good. It's good conversation.
We're still waiting for the full crew to join anyhow. So
Can you get
absolutely.
me? Just watch this.
So who's all coming to Austin?
I can't make it, unfortunately, just bad timing, but there's a good number of folks going from Apollo for sure, which is exciting. Everybody's looking forward to it a lot. Yeah, me too. I'm really keen to see proper people in 3D. Yeah, that's real life 3D. Yeah.
it's going to be good. Yeah, I know we'll have a healthy collection of the folks here.
Yeah, it's awesome.
There's still too many people coming down with COVID in my company for me to feel confident with in-person stuff yet.
Yeah, that's happening everywhere, it seems, for sure.
You're not alone.
Yeah, I also have this issue thing. I wear the badge. It's not very effectively. It's not very effective at protecting you from COVID, I gotta say. Reminds me to stay away, but yes, alas.
Every bit that helps. Well, we're happy to have you dialing in for your bit.
Yeah, really sad to be missing it, honestly. It will be a great event and I'm very disappointed, but there we go. I hope you guys all have a great time.
So I understand it's also available virtually. Is that? Mm-hmm. I think that's what you said on Twitter, Lee.
That's my understanding. Yeah, is that they're going to have a live stream.
Yeah, it's a $50, I want to say, sign up fee for the live stream. But
I think it should be free now.
Oh, is it free? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. All right. Yeah, I saw that on
Linux Foundation.
Perfect. That's even better.
Yeah.
During the sign up for the the process through OpenJS world, it said, hey, you can do this for $50 if you want for the live stream. So, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's free now. It's also they're gonna have the in-person tickets be free. Like basically the week before, they're gonna go to the UT and offer a bunch of college kids.
Oh, that's great.
To come as well.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Awesome.
Always good to do that. Anyhow, we've got quite a lot of things on our agenda doc today. Super excited to get into it all. So let's kick things off. We've got 16 folks here too, so healthy crew today. All right, welcome everybody to the June 2022 edition of the Working Group meeting. Of course, as per usual, by us all showing up here, that means we agree to the membership agreement, participation guidelines, contribution guide, and code of conduct. Links to all of those in the agenda. Always worth the read. I wrote them. I think they're pretty reasonable. Some of them are dry. Some of them have a little bit of creativity swirl to them. Always useful to take an extra look. There's links there for your perusal. But as we usually do, let's do a quick round of just quick names to faces. I think most of the folks here are familiar, but every meeting there always ends up being a handful of folks who are new faces. So it's always good to get names to faces. We will go in the order that it appears in the agenda markdown file. And I'm at the top of that. So hello, everybody. My name is Lee. And I don't know if Adrone is here yet. So
Ben?
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm one of the new faces.
Welcome.
Yeah, hi, I'm Michael.
I think it's my turn. It's my first time here. Hello, I'm Martin. I work at Apollo with Hugh and Benoit, who's here. So as well. Hello, everyone.
Hi, I'm Benoit. I work with Martin and Hugh.
Hey, I'm Alex.
Welcome to you both.
Matt Yelp.
Hey, I'm Benji.
Do we have Bobby here? I don't see Bobby here yet.
Hi, I'm Marco.
Hi, I'm Nick. I'm a new face.
Welcome.
Hi, I'm Rob. I'm with Shopify.
Hi, I'm Roman, Microsoft, Seattle.
Hey, I'm Greg, Intuit.
Is Mark on? No Mark.
I didn't see Mark Andre here. Just lose it to you, Stephen.
All right, hey, I'm Stephen at Netflix.
Hi, all. Hugh here.
Hi, Ivan.
Hey, Derek from Apollo here, first time.
Matt, are you here?
Let me unmute myself. Oh, sorry. Did I get ahead of myself?
No worries. Go ahead.
I'm Doc. Is this posted publicly by any chance?
Yes. All videos end up on YouTube.
Okay. I'm with Postman, and I was going to make an announcement, but I better not do it if it's going to be public. Not time yet.
I don't know how many readers or viewers we get. It's mostly for being able to go back. But
now I'm interested. I don't know.
Well, so yeah, all right. I'm going to go ahead and do it. I'm going to take. So they asked us not to post this on social media. So technically, that's not what I'm doing. I am a member of the first cohort of Rust Foundation Fellows. I just found out a couple of days ago that I'm going to be a Rust Fellow. So
that's awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Did we miss anybody else?
I was having technical trouble, so hi, I'm Matt.
Welcome, Matt. For those of you who did an intro and your name doesn't appear on the agenda yet, please just send a pull request. We'll make sure we get them merged. It's always good to make sure we have a good roster of who got to show up. Awesome. Well, fantastic to see many familiar faces and a handful of new ones. Welcome. We've got plenty to do today. So I just want to spend just a quick minute looking over the agenda and making sure that we've got all the right stuff in the right order. So we're going to talk about composite schemas, experimental directives, a clarification of root operation types, client control nullability status update, an update on the one of type, an update on unions implementing interfaces, and a companion subject of unions of interfaces and or unions. Roman's got some general spec issues to dig into, and then meta fields on the SDL. That's a fair amount of stuff. Is that the right set of things? Are we missing anything? Does that order sound right to everyone?
Sounds good.
Cool. Silence is golden. Looks like we've got the right set of things. All right, before we dig into that agenda, let's make sure we have any action items that need dealing with, we can deal with. Looks like we have 3 that are tagged as ready for review. Thank you, Benji, for the grooming as per usual. All right, adding non-normative note that GraphQL requests are not the same thing as HTTP requests.
I've addressed that with a very minor pull request to the spec, so it needs some review, but at least the initial action there has been taken. So now it's just at the review stage. So please feel free to chime in there.
Fantastic, thank you. I marked the pull request as an editorial change since that seems to be what it is. We'll close the action item since we've got stuff going on, and we'll review that one at a later date. Adding the security document to the GitHub repo. I think I merged that one for you already, which means we're done, right?
Correct.
Fantastic. Thank you for doing that. Very cool that we can have the top level GitHub repo that just scatters those things in all the right places. Very cool feature. We wanted to have a discussion thread on naming conventions for client controlled nullability. Yep. And you've created such a thread. So fantastic. I'm sure you'll tell us about that a little bit later. Awesome. Happy to see 3 of our previous action items closed. We still have a handful of open ones from last meeting. Just looking at them, final editorial review, I think that one is on me. Intersection type proposal, refining tests, Yakov, that one's on you. Stream and defer, ensuring our spec wording is accurate. Perhaps we'll hear a little bit about that later. Client controlled nullability then has 2 other open ones. A feedback on alphas and digging into the AST, but those may not be urgent.
The AST discussion thread is up.
Oh, it is. Fantastic. Okay. Since you got a discussion thread up, we will close that issue.
And I think we can close the one about the adding more tests also. I think it'll be addressed, in this meeting.
Which one was that? Intersection type? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. I think we've abandoned the intersection type actually, but the adding more tests for the unions issue, I think we're good.
I'll just take a note of that before I close it.
There's just one other thing that I wanted to raise. I don't want to discuss it here, but I just want to make you all aware. I've opened an issue asking whether 2 hours once a month is long enough, because we keep having some long meetings, and I suspect this one is going to be a long one as well. So by all means, engage on that issue, but not for discussion right now.
Why not, by the way? I thought I've seen it in the agenda, so we can spend 5 minutes.
Let's tack that one to the end. And if we run out of time to not talk about it, then maybe that's another feather in your cap for why this is a worthwhile thing to talk about. So happy to toss in that bit of recursion. But yes, thank you for opening that, Benji. These meetings used to be 3 hours, and we talked about them being a little too grueling and cut them back to 2. But always worthwhile to have a conversation about that. Okay.
By the way, I suggested one thing in this thread, to take 5-minute breaks after 1 hour to make it less grueling and less tiring. So think about this, maybe for this meeting as well, for coffee and all other stuff.
Okay, I like it. Keep an eye on the clock. All right, well, what you say is true. We have quite a lot of things to dig into, so let's dig into them, and we'll try to hold ourselves to the timing here. The first one up is yours, Benji. So floor is yours.
Cool, thank you. Okay, so there are a lot of different ways of taking multiple GraphQL schemas and merging them into one larger GraphQL schema. Sometimes these GraphQL schemas are just in different files on your file system. Sometimes they're on remote network locations. Sometimes there are other microservices. There's lots and lots of different things that are going on. But it is quite common in the ecosystem to try and build one larger GraphQL schema from a lot of smaller ones. There are approaches like Apollo's Federation, there's schema merging, schema stitching, GraphQL modules. Hazura's got the GraphQL joins. I've forgotten for a moment what the, there's a number of other ones as well, so there's loads. So I thought it would be quite neat if, for the common functionalities that all of these different things depend on, or where they are relatively common between them, if we were to able to define like a specification so that everyone can use this commonality and then really add value in the places where things actually differ, rather than everyone reinventing everything every time. So what I thought I would do here is say, here, I've got this idea, what do you all think? But in the interim, I opened the issue, and we've had so many people interested in this. There is currently 43 comments on the thread. We've got lots and lots of the different companies that are using these things or building these things involved, including the likes of Hazura, Apollo, the Guild, and various other people as well, key players and also key users of these technologies. So basically, I propose that we open a working group to explore this, to see where there is commonality, and to see if we can build some kind of shared specification for some kind of foundations that we can all build on.
I dig this a lot. By the way, a thought occurred to me relative to what you're talking about before about whether or not we needed more time. We have a handful of these things that we kind of run like parallel working groups. And I think I mentioned before, I'd like to start thinking about these like subcommittees. So there's one working group, that's us a lot. And we have a handful of things that sort of spin out and demand more time. And one of like a nice operating mode that I'd like for us to get into is for these things that really deserve more than 15 minutes once a month. They ought to be breakout sort of subcommittees with the set of folks who care the most about it, to get into the weeds together and go through all of the like subtopics involved here, and use these monthly meetings to basically report progress. And then basically what you're doing, Benji, like ask for those who are interested to come join the next handful of meetings. And then you can kind of decide whether you want to meet monthly or twice monthly, or whatever cadence makes sense for whatever phase that's in.
I'm very much in favor of that. One key thing that you said there was about the reporting back. And I think that's what we lack a little bit at the moment. I think some of these subcommittees feel uncomfortable, like bringing their topics to the working group meet because they don't want to like cloud up the agenda. So if we had a way of basically like time boxing that. Like, this isn't a period for discussion of this stuff, unless they need a discussion, in which case, by all means, file a discussion topic, but just status updates of here is where we're at. If you're interested, if you agree, if you disagree, here is how to get involved.
Makes a lot of sense to me.
I like that a lot as well, and that handles a lot of the issues that we're having in the HTTP group.
Yep, that's the other one that I had in mind. I would love, I think there's actually a lot of really important work happening there, and making sure that that crew feels more connected to this crew, I think would be very good. What's your action here, Benji? Do you just want people to be aware of this? Do you want to look to set a time to dig into this? What's next step?
Mostly, I just wanted like the say that yes, yes, this seems like a reasonable subcommittee. Let's create that, like an official stamp on it, you know.
Sounds good to me. I think you've identified a real problem domain, at least. I mean, it's entirely possible that you dig around and you're like, never mind, there isn't actually enough overlap ground here to standardize something, but you can only do that after seriously considering the space. So seems very worthwhile to have a set of crew come together and talk about it.
Excellent. In which case, I guess the next step would be to merge that document that I've raised, and then we can get other people adding themselves to it. And I will set about organizing an initial time, which I'll try and do based on the locations that people put in there. See if I can find a small window that overlaps. I imagine that's going to be quite challenging, but we'll do our best.
Can I suggest something? So probably to make it clear this way or the other way, so that the result of this, of the work of this group, it will not be some sort of standardized Apollo federation kind of thing for runtime and so on, but no changes, no suggested changes to this, to the official spec. What I feel like this kind of effort might actually result in recommendation to this group to add something modular features to the main specification. Is this a possibility?
I think it's definitely a possibility. Yeah, I put the realm of potential output of this being either or both of a sort of companion spec of, if you are doing composite schemas or schema merging or federation, here are the building blocks by which you should do it. That is, you know, you could completely abandon that and still call your thing GraphQL. It's an additive spec. But if there are missing fundamentals, there are missing key building blocks, then we ought to look to main spec changes as well to unlock those.
Yeah, like
very curious to see what will come out.
Module, let's say keyword or something, right? Okay, so just to say that this is a possibility as well. Because from the text, it looked like it's mostly about runtime kind of merging from existing, you know, Apollo-like.
The framing that I would say is that I don't want to apply any constraints at this phase. I would want to wait for a recommendation. So if this subcommittee comes back and feels strongly that the right way to go about this problem is with key additions to the core grammar, then fantastic. Like, we'll have a conversation about that. It seems
okay. Great.
Go ahead, Ari.
Thank you.
Ari, were you trying to say something?
I'll throw in one thing here, or you can feel free to interrupt. But the topic of merging multiple schema, forming composite schemas, is, as Benji showed, has a lot of very, very interesting subtopics that are useful, but also could be even thought of their own kind of things, like identifying a way to identify objects, for caching that might be useful for caching, relay, and all sorts of different things, as well as transforming schemas. That's also pretty interesting on it in its own right. So it could be that this could get super interesting And I'm not, and I think it's great to explore, that, but we might end up maybe having a couple different add-ons that sort of fit together in some way, and that could be exciting too.
Yeah, I completely agree with that interpretation. Yeah, and from my point of view, like I'm particularly interested in Ivan's topic at the end of today, the metadata stuff, because I see that may well be a precursor that we need for any composite schema spec. I do, like at the moment, I'm thinking it's going to be one or more separate specifications, but we will be contributing back to the main spec for functionality that we need. So I think it aligns with everything that's been discussed so far.
Awesome. Well, it seems like we have a pretty clear next step. Thank you, Benji, for leading the charge here, and I'll leave it to you to set some times for that subcommittee. Let's get to the next piece. Martin, that's yours. Experimental directive. Floor is yours.
Yep. So I made a few slides. How can I share? Yep. Let's share everything. It's not going to take long. I can reassure you, it's only 5 minutes to set up the stage. I'm here to talk about @experimental, which is the counterpart of deprecated for new fields in your GraphQL API. This is issue number 943. If you haven't checked it out yet, it's on the GraphQL spec repo, and yeah, you cannot click my presentation, but I guess you can find it on the GraphQL spec repo. Before diving into the details, a little bit of context of one use case, why this came up. I'm a client developer. I work for Apollo Kotlin, so I do a lot of mobile apps mainly, in addition to obviously a lot of libraries. And I'm working on this small app that's a conference app. So it has a very simple schema. It's a conference with a list of speakers, a list of sessions. Each session has an ID, a title, description, lots of fields. And we wanted to add a start date and an end date. And as you know, time is hard. So as we were working on this, we had a lot of questions about whether it should include a time zone or whether it should be just local date. How do we format this, everything. Well, this presentation is not about time APIs, but we ended up using a custom Scala named Instant because we have this class in Kotlin named Instant, and using ISO 8601 specification to serialize a string. And because we didn't want to burn the start and end names, we ended up naming that start instant and end instant, and we were feeling kind of okay, like this could work, but we were not 100% sure it will scale and it will work in the long run. But we still wanted people to be able to build apps with that, but not send them to production, obviously. So we were like, what if we could signal something like this to the front-end developers, that a given field is experimental. So entering experimental. If we take a look at the proposed definition for the directive, it's really the deprecated counterpart. So it's a directive, you can put it on field arguments, input fields, in values. And it also has a reason. As far as I'm concerned, I'm always using experimental or something like this, but as we'll see later, there might be other usages there. And the nice thing is that it allows a lot of nice tooling, like in addition to signaling in the API that the field is experimental. In Kotlin, we can do code gen, and we can add Kotlin annotation representing the GraphQL directive. So this experimental here, it's an Apollo annotation, it's an Apollo Kotlin annotation that says, if you're using this field, be aware it might change in a backward incompatible way. And Kotlin has all these nice opt-in requirements, which are themselves experimental. So it's a lot of experimental all over the place. But the important thing to remember is that if you're using an experimental field inside your code and you're using CodeGen, you will have the warning directly inside your IDE, something like this, a little tooltip. You will also have it if you compile from the command line. So you can think of use cases where you have a given build for production, and this build fails whenever a warning is triggered. So that makes sure that you never ship an app with experimental fields in production. And if you really, really want to, you can remove the warning by adding an opt-in experimental annotation in the code. There are a few people already using something similar in the wild. I'm pretty sure there are more than this list, but GitHub has something called Schema Preview, where you can get a subset, or you can get different version of a schema by using the HTTP accept header. So if you want to have the merge info, for an example, which is not stable yet, you just send the HTTP, I don't know, there's a long line with a MIME type, and you get the extra fields. I think someone mentioned Netflix uses deprecated for this reason, to filter them out from introspection with a reason experimental, which is kind of fun. I'm pretty sure there are other places which I'm forgetting about here. And that leads me to the last slide, which is questions. So first one is from me: do we need an experimental reason? I'm myself always going to put something like this field may change without warning in the backward compatible way, or something like this. And second question, which is actually linked to the first one, is do we need to put more metadata to this directive to accomplish something like the Github previews, where you can have several set of fields grouped together? Third question and fourth question are also linked. And I think this is a big one. It's about introspection, and this is why I'm also super curious about the presentation from Ivan later today. Is how do we filter these experimental fields in introspection? Do we include them by default? Do we not? Do we make a parameter like for deprecated fields? And more generally, like how do we communicate this to the client? And that was it for my small presentation. It was my last slide. So thank you for listening.
I feel like that is a highly needed directive, but I wonder if we could create one that's more broad, more flexible, something, for lack of a better name, like a with comment, so that although you could add whatever text you wanted and it could apply to experimental, it could also apply to anything else that we hadn't thought of today. My real concern with experimental is that it in itself doesn't mean anything. It just supplies a comment. And so to have an official directive that doesn't really do anything seems dangerous.
Yeah, that's my sense too, is like, let's start with the mechanism that we want and then how to describe it. So you pointed to Kotlin. I think that's actually really interesting because thank you for having another reference of where this kind of behavior is happening. Interesting thing happening in Kotlin is they started with an experimental annotation and then deprecated it in favor of opt-in for the same reason that Gabe, you just mentioned, right? That experimental is too specific and they wanted to instead talk about the mechanism, which maybe then would imply some behavioral changes that you might want, which is, you know, this is how deprecation works as well. It's like they do not appear in introspection unless you explicitly ask for them. And maybe we would want a similar behavior here. I had one thought, which is, you know, with deprecated stuff, it kind of makes sense that there's like a list that is constantly added to. But with opt-in or experimental, it may be the case that, especially for a larger schema, there could be like many different experimental things happening simultaneously. And it might be dangerous to say, okay, I want to include all of that experimental stuff, but only to use this one very specific feature. And now I've opened up this whole surface area of potential problems for, you know, my huge, imagine you're a company with 100 front-end engineers using your stack, and they've got, you know, dozens and dozens of experimental features available. It's like you either have all of them or you have none of them. That doesn't seem like the right mechanism. So it could be, rather than you had this open question about, do we need an experimental reason, or maybe that it's actually just like flag name or something. It's like, I want to opt into, and then you list the feature name. And so that, you only turn on the features that you ask to opt into. And so rather than it being purely a symmetrical accompaniment to deprecation, it's actually a different behavior where you actually supply the list of opt-ins that you want to be included.
Wasn't that something that GraphQL Ruby has, like these feature flags? I remember they had something like this.
I can comment on that, Michael. Martin, you also had like the GitHub preview stuff. One of the reasons we did that was to group experimental stuff together as one feature. We used feature flags as well from the GraphQL Ruby implementation, and that worked well. So I definitely agree with Lee there about experimental or opt-in on one field might be, not so optimal. But I also did want to say something weird about those kind of mechanisms. Is there is kind of a catch-22 sometimes where you mark something as, hey, be careful, we could remove this at any point. And then clients will be like, well, I'm not necessarily interested in that. That feels dangerous. And those who do end up using it, well, you won't remove it later if they start using it heavily. So I will say in practice, and that's not related to the spec, it's actually very hard to manage. When there's a lot of usage, they don't end up experimental anymore. And if there's no usage, you haven't really tested your experimental stuff. So that's kind of just a practice note.
I have seen a not grouped by feature, but just like another angle on this problem is to have an internal only API. It's like you need to be in your company's VPN or something to access it, which all of your local developers are. That exposes all the experimental stuff, which means you can start developing it against it, but you couldn't ship it. And that limits the pain that you're talking about, Marc-Andre. Like you couldn't end up shipping it and then depending on it because it's employee only.
And I'll add, Marc-Andre, the deprecated has that similar feel that even though it's marked as deprecated and it could be removed at any time, you're still having a difficulty because you have to time the removal with all your users. I feel like of all things, your schema is about communication, and deprecated does still have value in that way because you're communicating that you are working on it. But experimental does that as well. And I think that there is a wide variety of things that you would like to communicate about a field or about a type, that something that just adds to introspection some text, and it could be whatever you want, or you can group them in certain ways. I think that has great value.
The other thing that maybe, oh, sorry, go ahead, Roman.
So can I suggest something? So it looks like this experimental is most, in general, it's for POCs. So for example, we decide to try something. I'm server guy, and there are a couple of client guys, and we want to try something new. And I'm adding some field, and they are trying. At the same time, there are other clients, and they suddenly see this, and we need to give them a hint. Hey, this is for special stuff, it's experimental. Don't do this. And so basically regarding removing it, it should not be a problem or a question. We warned you, this is experimental for somebody else. What I'm saying is that when there are multiple teams using the internal API, this is a good way to communicate to those who are outside, let's say, closed circle about this, that this is something that might not be there. So this is one thing. The second thing, I think the experimental message is also good, because we might identify there that this is for this team, for this, don't use it if you're not there. Or we are about to remove it next month or in version 3. Be prepared. But basically, again, this is all POC, proof of concept kind of applications, not production, right? So the last question is, why it should be in the main spec. And I think this can be a perfect standalone directive with all its usefulness, and it will be fine, except that it's not visible to introspection. And that's again, we're coming to this problem about that directives or not all stuff is visible to introspection. That's why I guess the main reason we're discussing it here. And I would just say that this is a big problem, long-standing problem, and I'm about to discuss it in my presentation. So basically, if we had this, the directives, the list of directives is returned through introspection, then we wouldn't even need this conversation at all.
I think there
is value,
there is value in standardizing these directives though, right? Because tooling such as GraphQL and various other tooling like that, they can't make use of an experimental directive if they don't know what that is. So whether it's specified in the GraphQL spec itself, or whether there's like a secondary specification that is shared across the community, you know, those are separate choices, but
yeah,
it's not something that should just be designed within your company, because otherwise that shared tooling won't benefit from that.
But on the other hand, we must discuss current situation. We must discuss it here to have this extra property is experimental on introspection.
Yeah, I think the introspection piece is the key one. Is there actually a behavioral change happening? And if the answer is yes, then obviously it must come through introspection. And if so, then it clearly must be standardized, because introspection isn't something that we are typically extending. And if it is purely metadata, then I'm with Roman that this is pretty easy to just add. And there's a separate conversation about how to expose metadata in a generalized way, which has come up a few times. But Stephen, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I think Benji articulated it well as far as the value of having it in the spec, but I mean, I think it is just metadata in a sense, as far as how it gets transmitted in introspection. It probably could be fine to do that in a generic way, but also having it standardized in the spec, just as far as like, this is, you know, it's called experimental or opt-in or whatever, and this is what it means. You know, it does allow tools like GraphQL to incorporate some default functionality for it, and there is a lot of value in that. And so then the trick is that, you know, exactly how you handle this type of thing is going to vary in different companies. Even we found within Netflix, we've had a directive called experimental for several years, and what's interesting is that it is you know, the subtleties of how you do experimentation stuff are very different for like our enterprise apps and everything using GraphQL, and then like our consumer apps, where on the consumer side we're doing you know, like a lot of different A/B tests in production, you know, that are kind of a form of experimental, and so the answer of like, is this, you know, you're allowed to use this in production? It might depend on your company, and so, you know, just expressing in the spec though still that experimental implies a contract, which is different than the normal contract in that you know, this is likely to change, whereas normally you introduce something in GraphQL schema, you're saying that this is normally not going to be just arbitrarily broken. And then kind of like deprecated, the details of how you do that flow, you know, can vary.
Agreed. So Martin, do you feel like you have enough information to stew on this? And do you have a sense of the sort of core questions at play?
I have the questions, yeah, for sure. What are the next steps there? Like, should I proceed and try to make a PR on the spec, see where that takes us, or should I don't know, continue in the ticket?
Yeah, my read is that you're hearing interest, that this is a problem. You pointed out a handful of existing cases where people are showing this behavior, but we've heard from folks where those have left folks feeling shortchanged in the past and some of the pitfalls. So I think coming at this rather than coming at it with like, hey, we ought to have an experimental directive, but like, hey, here's the problem, and here's the missing mechanisms that we ought to have, and then here's the additions to the language that will enable those mechanisms. And then, hey, last time we talked about this, here are a handful of questions that arose, and here's the stab at answering them. Maybe the right next path forward. Which, if it's useful to do that in terms of a pull request, then fantastic, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that form, whatever is useful.
I think that what we had is that the outcome actually depends on some other things like introspection and exposing directives or meta fields or whatever, right? So let's just wait this meeting to the end of this meeting, how it goes, and follow this other thread.
Yeah, the introspection part is dependent on that, but I think the formal specification is its own thing, or like,
because if you can
yeah. Go ahead.
If you can actually, through introspection, let's say in the next version, through introspection, you can reach the list of directives and find out that this is certain fields have experimental flag, then this changes a lot in this discussion.
Yeah, what I mean is just that's the introspection part, but formalizing an experimental directive could have its own value.
Yes, I do agree.
And what I'm taking from this discussion is that whether it's going to be an at experimental or at opt-in directive is a big question. So I can make a proposal for an at opt-in and a mechanism to group experimental directives together, or group of experimental stuff. I don't know how to say it. But yeah, I can come back with something, with a couple of proposals to model this metadata, and then you can tell me what you think.
Sounds great. Thanks for the presentation. Super interesting. Okay, next up on our list, Ben, clarification for root operation types.
Yeah, so hopefully this will be quick. The basic problem here is that if you have a schema and it doesn't define mutation or it doesn't define subscription, the spec and common sense say, that means the schema doesn't support mutations or subscriptions. But there's not actually a validation rule to check that. And a lot of GraphQL libraries surprisingly will validate any such query, even if the fields are like totally bogus. And certainly they should reject it. So this is a PR to add some explicit validation language. It's number 955 in the spec repo. And it's just the explicit language that, like, if you have a query, its root operation type has to exist. There are a couple of details we can, I don't know how deep we want to get into the exact by shedding the exact language, but that's the idea.
I've read this pull request and it's very simple, and I'm very much in favor of it.
I went ahead and tagged it RFC1, but it seems like it's pretty dang close to the criteria for RFC2 since you've got a pull request open as well. I don't know. Anyone have any other comments? Anything sticky that comes out of this? Or Ben, anything that we should be thinking about?
The one other thing that I didn't actually put in the pull request is the spec also says in the section where it has this stuff that you have to have a query type, and there's not actually a validation rule for that either, and a lot of libraries don't actually validate that. I did not include that for two reasons. One is because the schema side is a little less consistent in where it includes validation rules in the first place. And two is I don't know if that's likely to, I would think that real schemas are going to have a query type. But I don't know how many, when I tried in one of the libraries I was making a pull request for, when I tried introducing that, it broke a bunch of tests. I was kind of like, is this really even worth it? So that's something to think about, is whether to make that explicit as well. But of course, if you validate on the query side, then at least you're not getting a query, or on the operation side, you at least know you're not getting a query if the schema doesn't support it.
Yeah.
But
I seem to remember we discussed this briefly before, didn't we?
But there actually is a GraphQL schema must itself be internally valid. This section describes the rules for the validation process. And then down there, we will describe that type names have to be unique and stuff like that. And you have to have a schema type. So that's at least how we implemented it also. So it's in the.
I didn't quite catch what.
I can post this section, I think. Oh, is this here?
Right. Yes. For schema extension, it says there is some validation, and yeah.
Yeah, I think we do validate that a query type exists. But you're pointing out an important gap, which is not about query validation, but about schema validation. Or sorry, not about schema validation, but query validation. That if you write a query, then if it's mutation or subscription, then such a type must exist in the first place. I'm kind of surprised that something else doesn't catch that, but okay.
I think there's also the point you were making about even query, like it might be reasonable to have the validation include, like, if your schema does not have a query type, it also at execution time is invalid, even if that should be an impossible state to be in. Because like there's a difference between execution level validation and schema level validation. And like once you join the two, then it's impossible to be in that state. But there's an intermediate state where that's possible.
Yeah, and the way it's written, it would actually cover that. If you somehow have a schema without a query type. Nice. But yeah, the only reason I even believed that I wasn't just missing this is that a bunch of different libraries also miss it. And a lot of them just really copy the validation logic pretty directly, including GraphQL.js, which there's also a PR for.
Nice work. Okay, so I marked the pull request on the spec as RFC1, which means we agree that this is a reasonable problem to solve, and we've got early text. RFC2, I think, is making sure that the implementation is the right one and getting that fully reviewed and landed. I'll do a read through of the spec text that you gave to. So hopefully we will be able to advance this one relatively quickly. Thanks for catching this and digging into it.
Great. Thanks.
All right. Next up, Alex, an update on client controlled nullability. Floor is yours.
Yeah. So there's a few discussion threads up. I'm going to link both of those right now. One is this one that I just linked is discussing how we what we call the syntax that's being introduced, and this one is discussing the name of the proposal itself. I'm speaking at the upcoming conference, and I got to call this proposal something. I'm just going to close the polls 24 hours from now and call it whatever gets selected. Yeah, I don't know. We're kind of running out of time here. So have a read through those, and take your time. Just in 24 hours at noon tomorrow, I'll close it. And then the other thing is I saw that GraphQL 17 was opened up. Should I be targeting that instead of 16, or should I keep targeting 16?
That may be a question for Yvonne.
Yes. So we decided to start version 17, and we decided that most of the time we don't do bug fixes. Most of the time we either like add stuff or like add additional things, experimental things. So that's why idea now is to have like forward version in like development version, a stable version, and idea to backport. So first add into version 17, allow people to try it up. If you or somebody else need it in version 16, we can backport it. And right now, code base is very similar. We remove some deprecated stuff and we plan to do some changes, but it's not like total rewritten. It's more or less compatible. So backporting, it's pretty easy. By the way, right now you target in version 17, your branch is on main, meaning yeah.
Gotcha.
So from it's like independent of your proposal in a sense. It can be, it's like makes sense to merge it to version 17 and later to merge it to version 16 if somebody needs it.
Gotcha. Yelp's probably going to want it on 16, so I'll see about backporting it. The other update is that we're pretty close to merging lexing and parsing. Sorry, there's a bunch of noise outside. We're pretty close to merging lexing and parsing. We just need to solidify syntax names. So that'll happen shortly after we close the polls.
Do you have a PR link
for the JS implementation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just so I can update mine. Have a peek at yours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that was everything that I've been working on.
Nice. So the main call to actions here are just to make sure that we open up all those discussions and vote or chime in.
Yep. Yeah. Vote, read stuff, talk back and forth. And then the other action item I had was to open up a feedback thread for the alpha, and I'll do that once we have like an alpha of the server up.
Sounds good. All right then. Well, we are close to the hour mark. How do you all feel about taking a quick 3-minute-ish break? Or do you want to power through? Let's use the reactions tool. Thumbs up for take a break. Party popper for power through. All right, it's equally split. Nope, the thumbs ups have it. We're taking a break. I'll kill my video and mute, and we'll come back here in 4 minutes. So 2 minutes past the hour. All right. Give folks a sec to reappear. And then we'll dive into the next one, which Benji will be yours. One of. All right, whenever you're ready, Benji, feel free to get into it.
Cool. Hello again, everyone. We advanced the one-of input objects to RFC2 last working group. Since then, we have made a couple of very small changes. One is that Ivan did a thorough review of the GraphQL.js implementation, and in doing so, made the recommendation that we change the introspection field from one of to is one of in order to match the is deprecated that we already have for that. So that small naming has changed there. Another thing that we changed is that you can no longer apply the one of directive to an input object extension. And the reason for that is because when you validate an input, in the GraphQL spec, it says, here's what happens when you define an input and here's what makes it valid. And then when you have an extend input, it has its own rules. Those rules do not retroactively apply to the previously defined fields. So rather than introducing something that says, and now all of the previous fields that are already there cannot be non-null and so on and so forth, it was easier just to forbid it. So the only place that you can add the one of is on the input type itself and not on any input object extensions. Thanks to Lauren for spotting that one. The other question revolves around the idea that there are people in the ecosystem already that are using @OneOf, because it's been around for a little while now, over a year, I think. And so we have said before, I believe, that we can introduce new directives, and we actually put a note into the GraphQL spec recommending that people use prefixes. So from the GraphQL schema's point of view, we can add this directive, because otherwise we could add no directives and that would be no good. However, the question comes for implementations. Are we, when this gets added to GraphQL.js or GraphQL Ruby, so on and so forth, would this be seen as a breaking change that would require, for example, a major version bump? Where do we sit on that spectrum? And is that a decision for each of the implementations to make, or is it something that we should be making here?
I mean, it wasn't released yet. And the one-off directive is not part of a released spec version, no?
Correct. It's not yet released.
Yeah, then then it's not a breaking change. I mean, these are experimental features. We have implemented them also, but we will just change them.
But the next stage, right, is RFC3, where it would be.
In what sense, how it can be a breaking feature? I just don't understand. If we add this and suddenly how the old stopped working.
The introspection has changed. This breaks the contract.
No, that's not what I'm talking about here. No, it's more that there are schemas out there that are using their own one-of directive. Like the name is already in use in existing schemas that may even be production schemas. So from a GraphQL.js point of view, question is, if we suddenly introduce this directive, it may well break people's schemas where they are defining a directive themselves that is called one-of. And this isn't just specific to one-of, right? This is any directive that we add to GraphQL, should it require a major version bump of the various libraries when we introduce a new built-in directive.
I see what you're saying. So we certainly in the spec recommend that people choose names that are unlikely to be clobbered by a spec change. This one is also highly likely to be clobbered because probably the reason people are using it is because they've been keying into the discussions we've been having around adding it. So I don't feel a ton of remorse by stomping on people who've made that particular decision, but there are real ramifications here. Whether it needs to be a major version or not, I don't know. Maybe we can, if we know from a practical point of view who that set of users are, if this is like a abstract, like we know that they could exist, or if there's like truly a list, like here are the exact people we're about to go break, then we ought to be able to have a conversation about it. Otherwise, I think it's reasonable to say, you know, maybe we want to get this in alignment with one of the next major version bumps. It's not uncommon for us to do that in the past, as we've done like spec version cuts. We've aligned them up with major version releases of GraphQL JS. I don't have a firm opinion here, but I'm glad that you're looking out for this.
Other than that, I think that the proposal is basically good to go. So I'd be happy elevating it to RFC3 now. I don't think there's any. Oh no, wait, there is one other thing.
Yeah.
Thanks. So in order to experiment with what one-off would look like in output to see if that would have any effect on input, I have also raised the one-off objects RFC. To be clear, this is marked as a draft because it is not like final spec edits or anything like that. I'm not even proposing that we move this to RFC1 or anything like that at this stage. It's mostly just a punt to see what would the effects of this be, and thus is there any sort of symmetry that we're breaking between what would be one-off objects in output versus one-off objects in input. And the main question I think that comes out of it is around the handling of nulls. So it's this question of, do we require that one field is non-null, or do we require that one field is present and all the other fields are not present? So in a one-off output object, the fact of removing fields that you've specified is quite a significant divergence from the status quo. It has precedent in things like the skip and include directives, but those are chosen by the user rather than chosen by the server effectively. The directive does say that this thing is going to happen, so it's kind of okay, but it's also less okay. So the main question around that is, if we were to decide, for example, that it was okay or that we should keep those fields in, then does that mean that for input objects, we should also allow those fields to be present but null? I think that we're good to continue the way that we've currently proposed, which is that all other fields are forbidden, because we can allow that to change in future, but we can't go the other way. So we can allow additional nulls to be added in future if we want to change that behavior from what is currently proposed, but I don't think we can go the other way. But I may be mistaken. So if anyone thinks I'm mistaken on that, speak up.
I mean, honestly, for the input one-ofs, the one remaining thing that I still feel some nervousness around is how we are treating nullability. That the fields themselves do not express that they are non-null. However, the addition of this directive all of a sudden requires them to not allow null is a little confusing, and excludes potential space where you actually want to say, like, yes, I intend for this to be this branch of the one of, and the appropriate value for it is null. It's like cannot be represented in our current one of because of the way that we're treating null. And so, like, if this is causing us to gut check that decision, I think that's a reasonable thing for us to take seriously.
So on that, go on, Michael, Karen.
Does it really cause that? Because technically we can see so that null was set, so explicitly provided, even if it's nullable now. I mean, it's not, the spec is not written like that, but technically it would work to allow null. Or was there a case why we excluded that, Benji? I mean,
yes.
it could be.
I think for arguments, for separate arguments, we have explicitly state that it's a different situation, null or absence, for arguments with defaults. So we do distinguish when the JSON has the value and it's null, or the value is missing. At least that's standalone arguments. So I think, yeah.
That's why I mentioned. We are in the validation. We are explicitly looking if something is stated null or not. So that means we could also use null as value.
Yeah, we can apply the same logic here for fields of this one-off.
The
so we are
RFC
good.
is current. Oh, sorry, carry on.
We are good here, right? My impression. So that we can express this. If the value of the field now, then we just provide this value explicitly now, and we are not in violation of one-off.
We could do that, but that is currently in violation of the one-off, because the one-off explicitly says that there will be one field specified and that field will not be null. We do not have the concept of there being a cat that is null. We have a concept of this is a value. Either the value itself is null, or the value is a cat, or it is a dog, or it is a fish. It is not a null cat. That is something that we've explicitly disallowed, because this isn't, one-off isn't intended for setting like individual keys in an object. It is designed to represent a polymorphic type. So it is either a cat or a dog, and having a null cat doesn't really make sense. It's just a null thing. It's just the entire thing is null. At least that is how I have written it and my intent behind it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like a typical confusion of the way that we have expressed nullability in the first place by making nullable the default, and the concept of a tagged union. Like it's not completely uncommon to see, you could imagine it's a maybe cat or a maybe dog are your two branches in your union, where, either you are a cat person who doesn't have a cat right now, or you're a dog person who doesn't have a dog right now. And I'm coming up with a weird example that matches your example here. But that's what I mean. Like there may be potential data modeling that we are excluding, and we should just gut check that makes sense. I think actually the exclusion of data is one piece, and then also like, is this, will that be a surprise if someone does want to model it that way and finds out that like the null gets excluded? But I feel like this is the piece we've relitigated the most amount of times in this proposal so far.
It would be helpful if anyone who sees this as being an issue were to raise a comment with a use case where a null within a one-off would make sense, because I can't come up with any of those myself.
Yeah, there was like, I did a little short video on YouTube for that feature in Hot Chocolate. And that was the first question, actually. Why can I not set null? Like, they use a kind of like, you have to provide one value, but this value could also be null. Like, it's more about user decision. Like, you set something, and you have to set something. But I also can see that the problem there is, how do you force somebody then to set something? Like, how do you exclude null when the field is nullable, and we would allow null, right? That is essentially the problem. Like, if we were to allow null, how do we give the user the tool to say, I don't want to allow null? That would be,
you just use exclamation point, right? You make it explicitly a non-null type. It's still the one-off still applies.
But you cannot.
Right? Like
but you cannot in one-off. if you have multiple fields, and you cannot do it. They all should be nullable.
How it's written now. You could not do it.
Basically, can I
fundamental? Yeah, go ahead.
From the point of view of the server, there is a principle that accept, be generous on what you accept, and be strict on what you return. So here, from the server point of view, I'm receiving this request, and it's kind of not clear. Something is null. The only value is null. And so the best strategy for me is not to scream about, not to throw error, but let the resolver for specific service figure it out. So basically, I think it's okay. It's not an issue as for the rules of the GraphQL itself. That's my kind of point of view.
But Benji,
you lose on what you accept.
Benji, why did we exclude that we can put an exclamation mark there? I mean, it could be like we anyway enhanced the type system here. We could also.
I remember why we did that. It's because imagine a old client but a new server. So your new server is now aware of one of and is starting to take advantage of this type. But you have an old client, so maybe you're using an old version of Apollo client or Relay or whatever that's not yet aware of the one of type and the constraints that it applies. So if your server happened to introduce a type that had cat as a non-nullable cat input, dog as a non-nullable dog input, fish is a non-nullable fish input, and by the way, there's only one of these. The client that wasn't aware of this yet would say, hey, you can't only supply one because all three are required. Because it wasn't like the addition of this one of is new concept. So basically it's a backwards compatibility thing. We ought to assume that there's, for a significant amount of time, going to be this overlap. And this is a easing of the overlap problem where clients can completely ignore the fact that this one of exists for their local validation. The server still might, if it sends more than one of them, it might reject it. But this is important because one of is not like a brand new invention. It's a codification of an existing pattern. There are already servers that are expressing these one of, and they're just doing under the hood validation of your input. And this is now codifying it in the language and therefore giving us the power tools of GraphQL level validation. But in order to do that, they cannot mark them all as required, right? Because then you couldn't do one of, they're mutually exclusive.
That was absolutely one of the motivations behind that choice. Is the one that I've documented. But the other thing is, you're not going to win either way. If you make the fields all nullable, then it's confusing that one of them is required. But if you make all the fields required, then it's confusing that all of the rest of them are not allowed to be there and you're only allowed to specify one. So either way, you lose, and you need the one-off to give you that extra command. But the nullable version is the least confusing of those two situations, in my opinion.
Yeah, and there's definitely trade-offs with kind of conflating the absence with nullability of things, but it seems like that's a trade-off we've already decided to make with GraphQL to keep things a little bit simpler. And if for this we wanted to say that you do have to make a distinction between whether this field is present and whether the value is null, that could have implications beyond being confusing, even for maybe alternative types of serialization, where you make an optimization to like drop things that are null, and like you can get away with that since we're saying null and presence are absence are the same, and this would be changing that if we didn't do it the way that Benji has it here.
Okay, I don't know if we fully resolved this, but we are running close to your time. I think it has been helpful to open the one-of objects and express these pieces that feel maybe not in alignment yet. One thought that we ought to explore is not necessarily saying like, hey, if you really want these to be non-nullable, you have to explicitly mark them as such, but just kind of sidestepping this whole thing. Maybe this aligns well with Roman's suggestion of rather than this being a new input validation that will reject null values, to say like, if your type resolver under the hood encounters the null, it ought to reject it, and which basically preserves some future point where you could in fact mark them all as explicitly non-null. That, I don't know, to your point, that may be confusing, but we ought to give it a fair shake.
Just before we move on, there is also one complete alternative that we can do to this, and I'm not suggesting that we change very much of the spec text itself that is proposed, but instead of using a directive to represent this, we could just use an alternative syntax. So in the introspection, it would look exactly the same as it does currently. And for clients that don't understand one-of, it would look like an input object with all nullable fields. But in SDL, we could represent it more like a union, or more like a list of object types with a defined field. And maybe that would work around our discomfort of this, but I'm not sure whether that does address your concerns or not.
I don't know. I don't know if it addresses it. It reshapes it, but then you get into the slightly separate problem of having a new thing to parse, and that being sort of a higher burden for tools, also, which would encounter this and not know how to deal with it.
Also, if we have a new construct in a syntax, like a new keyword, wouldn't it end up in the new types then? Or you mean just behind input one-of?
I mean the fact that one-of isn't a directive, right? What is one-of is just a field. It's a Boolean field in introspection. How that's represented in the schema, in the SDL, sorry, is up to us. We've at the moment proposed that we represent this with a directive because it's the least work. We can already use the schema parsing, the parsing of directives to indicate that.
Yeah.
But really, we can just say it's an input object type that is a one-of. It's a one-of input object type. And the syntax for that could be one-of input and then something else, some other syntax. The fact, yeah, it's not a directive. It just is using directives right now.
No, I think syntax change should be the last resort. The first choice should always be directive. And then if it cannot be in any way implemented as a directive, then we go for syntax change. This is one thing. The second thing, think about this. So let's say we have already one-of, and we have a completely well-working server and client, and they all work perfectly, no bugs. Then if we do remove one-of from everywhere, they still continue working, right? I mean, directive. It means that it's an extra validation thing. And as long as both client and server conform with or without one-of, it all works the same. It means that, let's say, syntax change is completely unjustified. Even if, for example, if I decide to remove this directive from the schema for performance reasons, let's say, to avoid this meaningless validation, then can I do this? Yes.
Fair enough.
So basically, again,
let's move on from this discussion to the next one.
Yep. Yeah, I think you got the right next steps, Benji. Okay, next up, Yakov, floor is yours to talk about unions and interfaces.
Hey, okay, so we're moving from something that's probably much more going to be much more useful to something a little bit or very esoteric, but we're making some advancements toward being able to express that a union implements an interface, so that if a union is a field on an object, then that object can implement an interface. I basically went through from the last meeting. I went through and tried to make sure as best as I could that the tests were up to date. And then we talked about how we want to see the impact on introspection. And we decided definitely that because the union implements the interface, you should be able to query fields directly on the union. Because it should honor that contract. So we did. Benji raised an interesting point. I had assumed when we were talking about last meeting the effects on introspection, and that would mean that if you introspected a union that implements an interface and you asked for fields, the fields key on introspection, it should now give you the fields that are valid to query directly on the interface. And I ran into some trouble in actually trying to implement that. And then Benji wowed me by saying maybe that's not what we meant at all. So I guess that's the question. The immediate question for the working group is: do we want introspection to return fields for this union? So a union that implements an interface is basically like an interface that specifies no additional new fields, but adds a constraint limiting that interface to only a few types. So the question is, do we want introspection to? Benji's point was basically the union doesn't add any new fields, and so it doesn't define any in the SDL. There's and so the introspection shouldn't either. I don't know if anyone has any strong feelings on the matter.
It's interesting. It is it would be the first place where those things become decoupled, where currently anything that says it implements a particular interface is actually required to specify the fields that it implements, because they may be equivalent, but they may actually have a subtype. And so rather than having to crawl the chain and figure it out, they're just all there. You can just ask for all the fields for that particular type where you're at.
Yeah. So, and another wrinkle just to think about is that if we say that if we say that we do have to return those fields, it's not actually clear, 100% clear when you're writing the schema. So this is, hopefully I'm sharing a screen and I'm showing a whole bunch of types and interfaces. I just want to point I'll just run through it. Basically, the names should be pretty explanatory. You have one interface on top, you have another interface, then now it can get, you have a common interface that implements both of those. And then you have a few types that, that implement that common interface. Okay, so we have like a hierarchy of types. And then we have our union that's implementing that common interface, and therefore it also interfaces those other interfaces, and it's restricted to those types. So that's basically the scenario that we're talking about. So what is the shape? I mean, if that union has fields, the shape is obviously going to be defined by these interfaces, but it's not 100% clear. Like we know, because we have this example, that the common interface basically includes everything else, and that's going to be like the key type. That's actually the shape that we want and that we would want to return with introspection. But just looking at that one line, it's not directly, requires some algorithm and maybe some proving. Like I actually ran into a whole bunch of confusion on my part. So the implementation might be a little challenging, and that's not necessarily a reason to avoid it, because first of all, we should embrace challenges, but also because we're going to have to sort of figure out how to validate it, unless we just, so that's another wrinkle. So, it's food for thought. This is like not, we have definitely a lot of items, on the agenda today. So I basically wanted to raise that as sort of, the update, where I am with this PR, and we sort of stalled out over here. I think it's an interesting question. There's not a burning desire in the community for this feature. And I'm sort of feeling to myself that it may raise, some interesting problems, but not necessarily problems that we want to solve right now. That's basically where personally I am with this. If anyone has any strong opinions, they can definitely weigh in, though, or any opinions at all, or on the issues, that are obviously going to stay open. But this is not burning questions, but I figured I'd bring an update back to the working group.
I think that's fair. Our bar for net value of a proposal should be set fairly high, right? Like every change adds some complexity, but it also delivers value. And if what you're finding is that in digging through the full ramifications of doing this, there's a bit more complexity there than you hoped to find. And I think it's not unreasonable to say like, okay, maybe not stop exploring it, but explore it less vigorously or with less priority than some other pieces. I think that's acceptable. If the community is demanding this, or if we start encountering problems where we keep coming back to this, then that may shift that priority. But I'm with you on your take. Resonates.
And that also quickly covers basically the next issue. I mean, unless anyone wants to spend more time on this one. I know we got a packed agenda. Let me just quickly, I think this one is on the spec itself. So I'm going to just pull up that PR, bear with me. But basically the idea here was, what was the idea? Why do we want a union to implement an interface like explicit, with additional text? We basically wanted to allow you to define an object type that has a union field and then say it can implement an interface. Where the interface had an interface type for that field. So that's the same thing. Basically, we're trying to unlock things like this over here, where you have two potential types that want to interface and that want to implement an interface, but currently they can't because the type of that interface is a union. And right now you can't do, the only types that right now you can include within that union are object types. So in this schema, it's types like cow and wolf, but not an interface or not these other union types. So right now you can't do, here I've labeled these unlocked by this PR, you can't do this. And so it's not valid. So you can't really have like a full complex type hierarchy. Right, and we know that GraphQL's type system is not, favor simplicity over completeness for the reasons we were just saying. So, again, I basically sketched here one option for how you might, allow this. I happen to think that unions of interfaces, as opposed to unions of unions, is the most, has the most value add, because I think we often run into trouble in adding new types to unions, but if that type implements an interface, then I think that might actually help us out a lot. So that's basically, the same. It was similar to the idea before, but in terms of like overall value to the ecosystem, I think this change basically includes two changes. I'm letting you say you include unions in here and also interfaces. Including unions is might get a little ugly. You could also think about adding a constraint on the union, just how we talked about how you could have a constraint on a union to say that it implements an interface. You could, in theory, you could add an additional keyword over here and say that this union has to be, has to include only members of some larger union. And so then you would have the child union, I guess, not be specified within within this parent, but actually be specified elsewhere, right on the other union, and make this definition simpler. But basically, this is just a sketch of how we might, again, complete the type system, allow you to express a few additional things. But I would point out that as far as I can tell, the easiest, this is easier than the other change. Doesn't require new, those complexities that we were talking about before in terms of changes to introspection. And it also may add a lot of value, not for unions of unions, but for unions of interfaces. So I just wanted to get that might be something that I haven't yet done the implementation, that I might want to advance first before actually the other stuff.
This one actually also has introspection implications that are maybe non-obvious, but when you introspect a union and you ask for its possible types, right now we make a guarantee that that list of possible types are all objects, which, okay, so you could imagine, unfolding these and basically crawling the hierarchy of what's in the unions of unions of unions and get that list of object types.
Yeah.
But it's also the list of things that we would then show in the syntax with bars between them. So you can imagine like writing this of, oh, it's a cow cloning info, or it's a cow or a wolf. And then once you make it one round trip through introspection, then you've lost that intermediate mode and it's flattened it out.
So when I worked on the intersection, the failed intersection type, I basically put forward a solution. I think it's fairly straightforward. Basically, you have to introduce a new introspection field where it was, one would be possible types, which would be those crawled object types. And another one would be, I called it member types, which would be, how you defined it here. And it would be just the ones mentioned. I mean, that was my solution. But at least I know the solution. It does have intersection implications, but at least I know
the reason why the constraint is there is basically like when we were first assembling unions and interfaces, realizing that we wanted to avoid the distinction and the potential confusion, and it simplified, even though it is slightly more constrained, it reduces a whole surface area of complexity by saying there's not two things, you never have to crawl, you never have to like you can imagine a schema just being wrong by its member types and its allowed types just like don't agree for some bizarre bug or reason. It's like that whole class of issue is just gone. And so I don't know, it makes me nervous.
Well, how about I really do think this will make unions easier for the community. So I mean, that's basically my update. Basically, I was going to say that for next time I might try to work on this implementation, not of both things, not of just the unions of unions, but just of unions of interfaces, and I guess see where that takes us. And if we're still uneasy about it, then we'll see from there. I mean, that's my thought.
Yeah.
Yakov, is there a particular reason that this couldn't be done with just build tooling, for example? Like, do you want this union that you have here with interfaces and some types to be visible in a tool like GraphQL? Or is it just effectively a shorthand for listing out all of the possible subtypes?
I think, so that is a good point, actually. That's a very good point, because you can actually, a query that has, shares any possible types. I mean, a fragment that shares any possible types with the base can always be used, even without this new syntax. So this would help you with the type hierarchy, but not necessarily with the queries themselves. I mean, the queries should be valid already as long as any new union. So that's a good point. So it may not be as in demand as I think it is, but I think because it can already be used, it might make it might make more sense to make the type system more robust in this one sense as well. But again, the demand of
it seems like it's not just
is much higher. So.
Yeah, it does seem it's not just a build time thing. Like there's real like these sort of like diamond dependencies of fields that have implement interfaces, which like there's wanting to use unions to satisfy them, but there's like a constraint solve to the type system that's not expressible today, that like you're looking for a way to express something that would previously be marked as not valid is actually valid, but only if you can kind of clarify that such a constraint is being met. I feel like I'm nervous about this. I like your constraints implementing interfaces one better, but I appreciate that there's complexity under the hood in each. I don't know. I mean, there's something in here.
I think it's good to we had some questions in the spec repo, why isn't this possible? So I'm just glad to, put a little color on it and say that could be possible. Here are some things we ran into and consider. So I might push forward. I hit a roadblock in the other one. So lazy me, I might move forward a little bit more in this one and see where it takes me.
Awesome. Thank you for digging into it. Non-trivial space. So fantastic exploration. All right, Roman, next agenda topic is yours. Spec issues.
Okay, everyone. So it's a two-part presentation, and I hope I have enough time. But the first part is small things, and it's discussion link 969. And I posted it more than a week ago. Don't see any feedback or any opinions or nothing. Yes. So basically, it is small things. It's not about how GraphQL works. It's how we explain it. And the specification read one line by line and finding things like typos, some strange sentences, some repetitions, and so on. So you might think it's not that important at all, but I would suggest it to take it a little more seriously, because when you read a book, and there is such thing in publishing houses, in magazines, in serious organizations as editor, book editor. So his job or her job is to read it, read the publication line by line, word by word, and verify everything: spelling, grammar, references, internal reference, external reference, so on. So when they did end a good job, you don't notice it. But sometimes with this self-publishing, you read a book which was, on a made on a chip, and you start noticing this. This is extremely frustrating.
We have a GitHub tag for this. You should file these as pull requests. We have a GitHub tag called editorial, which any change that doesn't change the behavior of the spec, we tend to handle asynchronously. We do them quickly. But I think probably a better process, rather than listing them all in one discussion thread, because it's difficult to sort of weigh in on each of them and have one linear conversation. Split them up, make each one, if you have a specific, like for a typo, for example, just send that as a pull request. It should probably get merged relatively quickly. For something that's a little bit more in depth, you can at least make a proposal. If it's straightforward and it doesn't change behavior, then they tend to get just a little bit of editorial discussion if necessary, and then they get closed. For anything that warrants a discussion,
so
bring it here.
You suggest, okay, so I understand that for typos, which no discussion, I can just do pull request. There are probably only 10 of them. Total amount is 28 or 29. There are a couple of almost duplicates.
Others are, other things we do as editorial are just mistakes. Sometimes, we'll add a change, and we do our best to make sure that changes that get added scan the text to make sure that anything else that should change. Like I think one of them that I noticed in here was we say that a line break can't appear, and you pointed out that one can appear in a block. That was probably just a miss. So that's also an editorial change, and you should feel free to send pull requests for those as well.
Okay, but more serious issues, there are probably 10, 15 of them, which will require kind of participation. So essentially my ask here is not to discuss every one of them. It's just exactly what you're talking about, the further process. So I got that simple things, which is no question, I will just push it, right? What about the other things? Should I create separate discussions? Or
if there's not a proposed change, I would create a discussion thread. If there is a proposed change, I would make it as a pull request. That way there's something concrete to talk through. But yeah.
Separate pull request for each.
Yeah. That way we can keep discussion focused, because it may be the case that one of the particular changes is straightforward and easy to merge with a lot of agreement, while another one warrants discussion, and you wouldn't want to hold up the ones that are easy because of the ones that require more discussion.
Okay, so I will post it, please. Those items that require discussion or input from everyone, please take a note, because again, seeing this in such a document ruins the impression. People, you won't take it seriously. It's kind of look amateurish, when people. So let's fix this. That's it for me for the first small things.
Just to note, I've added an action item for you, Roman, to file these PRs and discussions.
Okay. Ready?
Go for it.
Okay, so bigger issues. So this is something that is not small things, and my goal is not to discuss them now and here. My goal is to start discussion in the future. So here, you would probably think some of you, many of you would think that's too much, that's too big change, but let's sleep on this and discuss later. And here's my impressions, recent impressions of the newcomer. When you come and start reading and something just doesn't make much sense. And on the overall surface of the entire spec. So here we go. So the agenda, there are basically 5 items I want to run through. And what is GraphQL? The definition, chapter order and titles. There are 2 chapters, SDL, its purpose, algorithms, and specification scope. So what is GraphQL? The definition, and that's what is kind of shocking and surprising for the newcomer is, for example, GraphQL, there is, I guess, the primary definition in overview is a query language designed to build client applications. I'm a server developer. Am I in the wrong place? It's not for me. Is it like React? Something that you can build the entire application in your browser without any server? It sounds like React, right? And you can create a tic-tac-toe game. You don't need any servers. So this is kind of strange. And second thing is it's a language, but many things in the spec are not about a language, way more than a simply language. And by the way, there are 2 languages if you think about this. So how I think it's somewhat can be improved, and let's look at similar things out there, how they identify themselves. And for example, gRPC is a blah blah framework. Thrift is a communication protocol. Avro is a framework, and OData is a protocol. So summary, the variations are framework, language, and a protocol, or is a protocol. I think the things they call themselves framework when actually they provide some tool or code, executable code, right? Like for example, gRPC, they actually provide code generators as part of the whole thing. So it's ideal language, it's a protocol, and plus it's actual generators that will generate you code in different languages. So that's, I think, the distinction when you call yourself framework. We're not framework. We do have a language, and I think we are a protocol. So suggestion is something like that. GraphQL is a client-server communication protocol. Plus, we mentioned 2 languages. One is IDL and request language. And I think one of important things or good things to do is to point out that we have two languages. Like, for example, gRPC, they have only one language, IDL. We have to, it took me some time to actually realize this as I was going through spec and through actual implementation of the code, that it's actually two languages, which are quite different. Now, chapter order and titles. So we have chapter language and type system. And the problem is with the language section, most of the sections, 11 out of 12, they describe request language, yes. But querying against what? Something that is not defined. And this type system is defined actually in the next chapter. So this order seems really strange. And after jumping back and forth, what is input object? What is this types, scalar types, and so on? I actually realized, that's the thing. So the type system is described after the language or the means to query against this type system. So basically, they should be, I think, in reverse order. Second thing, the titles are a bit misleading. The type system seems like it wouldn't have language. Language is all left in the previous chapter, but there is a lot of language there. Not as much as in the language section. It's just, it describes different language, SDL, not request language. So my suggestion, since we have two languages, so suggestion different order and different titles. First, to have a type system and schema definition language. And next we have requests, should be requests. That's kind of seems logical to me. Now the purpose of the SDL is quite unclear and was quite a discovery for me, that it's not like in other communication protocols. So basically IDL or SDL in our case, it's interface definition language. And it looks like it should be a complete description, definition of the API, particular API, like gRPC. For gRPC, protofile is this complete source of truth, complete definition of the language, and they generate server and client stubs. That's all you need to know to communicate. I actually, when I started getting into GraphQL, I expected this is something like this here, but was told that that's not the case. Actually, the explanation was provided by Benji that introspection is the source of truth, not SDL. So SDL file is built from introspection, and SDL is not source of truth, and SDL is for code first. Schema, whatever, code generators. And there was a mention in one of the discussions that exposing everything from through introspection, this is some security risk. This sounds like a really strange and not matching expectations for a newcomer. So it's different from other frameworks. It is not explained in the spec. And strange thing, API, any particular API, it cannot be described before it is built, because it's you gotta have introspection API working in order to describe the interface. While in many situations, before you build, you actually, like in gRPC, you write down by hand protofile or SDL IDL file, and you share with your other teams, with your team. This is design. So That's how you describe the interface. You use the textual representation of the description. You share it, and then you implement it, and then you have introspection working. So as for, and then it's unclear why we will even spend so much time on SDL grammar if it's only for code generators. There is a counterexample that parser code generators, they all use these special languages, but they don't have any spec or standard for this. It's every code generator defines its own language, basically. So my suggestion is to move in line with the others and declare that SDL file is a complete description. All you need to know to communicate with the servers. We recommend to publish SDL file at some of two implementers. We need to state that introspection is equivalent to SDL file, which means that, and it's actually different format or representation. SDL is for humans, introspection is for tools. We need to upgrade then introspection model to expose everything that can be found in SDL. Everything should be there. Then all these discussions that we have about one-off and how it's can be discovered by the client tools or all other attributes, directives, they will go away by default. Then it will make things much easier. For example, the experimental, it will be automatically exposed through introspection. Algorithms. So here is an example. Operation name uniqueness. What do you think about this algorithm? Is it really helpful to explain what does it mean uniqueness and how to implement uniqueness? And we have a lot of this. I don't think we need this. I find it even insulting for server developers, because as if we don't know how to implement uniqueness. That kind of things, they add a lot of absolutely meaningless, empty fluff. We pretend to be kind of sophisticated while we look silly. It adds a lot of lines to the spec without any beneficial content. So, and finally, specification scope in general and our principle of what we put in the spec. If we agree and declare that GraphQL is a communication protocol, then it should describe only communication, what's on the wire. It should not touch how the server particularly does this, which means that all this validation and most of the execution things don't need to be there, because it's out of scope of a communication protocol. As I said, much of this stuff is purely obvious things, all these algorithms. I didn't find any except maybe one or two algorithms that actually add some value, and even like, for example, collecting fields and merging fields, they are complex, but I think the simple couple of paragraph word explanation would make it much better than this long and sophisticated, supposedly sophisticated algorithms. And finally, part of this zero or parallel execution, let's leave it for the future. I have a lot to say of this, but this is one of the things that I think should not be even mentioned in the specification about communication protocol.
We're at time, so
okay.
I want to wrap this up. Please open a discussion thread with pieces of these. Some of these are spicy takes.
Intention.
I want to say that a lot of these I think are going to be really interesting, healthy discussions. The one that I really firmly disagree with is the idea of removing algorithms. The spec is the algorithms. They describe what you should expect to see the behavior output be. The implementation doesn't have to literally line by line mirror the algorithm. We have language in the spec text that say, as long as it appears to produce the behavior described by those algorithms, it's accurate. But that's actually especially when you get into the sort of legal pieces of this, does something comply or not? The algorithms are the way in which you do that, rather than just a descriptive paragraph. All the rest, I think, is very open to discussion, and you ought to open discussion for that one as well. But thanks for assembling the content and opening some spicy discussions. Always really worthwhile to discuss. But anyhow, I know we're a couple minutes over. Thank you all for all the updates, the hard work, and the interesting discussions. I will see many of you next week for the GraphQL Conf. I know many of you will dial in too. Welcome you to see you. And then we'll keep the conversation going next month. Sorry, guys. Yvonne, for having to bump your talk. We'll talk about it next time.
By the way, can we, for 1 minute, discuss one of my suggestions about the second meeting or so, to create automatically overflow meeting a week from the main. So if we have the situation just like this, we automatically have next Thursday meeting to continue with this agenda. So can we just vote or discuss this for 1 minute, and maybe then automatically set up next Thursday the meeting to discuss whatever is left?
I'm going to suggest we take that one async, since this particular session, that would be hard to do, since many people are going to be at the live conference next week. And so it might be a little challenging to get everyone together. There's going to be conference talks going on next Thursday.
Yeah, one announcement. So like my topic was last minute, so I'm like expected it can be like pushed out. I shared like a link in comments. I will check if it's got agenda or not. I will to notes. I will update agenda, and I will basically try to rewrite the same thing into RFC on a spec repo or like working group repo. I actually forgot where it's right now. And thanks for like discussion. Actually, it's like some of discussion happened in comments. I think, and I'm totally okay with like waiting next month. For me, it's important that all people present and focused and have like dedicated time for it. So it's not like random, or there is like all separate overflow meeting with like different participation. So like if you can take my anecdotal case as evidence, I'm totally for moving it to next one, and I will be ahead of line in next one. I expect. Yeah.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Thanks, Yvonne. All right, folks, that's a wrap for today. Thanks again. Talk to you all next time.